What if every person alive today carries the genetic echo of a moment when humanity was reduced to the edge of silence? When our entire species may have numbered no more than a few thousand souls. Not a myth, not a metaphor, but a real point in deep time, written into the code of your own body. To understand it, we must go back, far beyond memory, beyond history, into a world that did not yet know how close it was to disappearing. 74,000 years ago, the Earth is a place both beautiful and indifferent. There are no cities, no borders, no names, only land, sky, and the slow rhythm of survival. Ice sheets dominate the northern continents, vast and relentless, grinding their way across the land. The climate is unstable, caught in the long pulse of glacial cycles that tighten and release like the breathing of the planet itself. Africa, by contrast, is alive with motion. Grasslands stretch toward the horizon, shimmering under a harsher, more unpredictable sun. Herds of antelope and other great animals move like flowing rivers, carving paths across the terrain. Predators follow in silence, patient and precise. Life here is abundant but never secure, and among it, almost unnoticed, are humans. Not the architects of empires, not the explorers of space, but small, scattered groups of early Homo sapiens living close to the edge of existence. Their numbers are few. Their tools are simple, stone shaped by careful hands, fire coaxed from the elements. They move with the land, following food, avoiding danger, adapting moment by moment. They do not dominate this world, they endure it. Each day is a calculation, each night a risk. The young must be protected, the old must be carried or left behind. Knowledge is not written, it is remembered, shared in gestures, in sounds, in instinct. Survival depends not on strength alone, but on cooperation, awareness, and something harder to define, an emerging intelligence that has not yet revealed its full potential. But even as these small human groups navigate their fragile existence, the planet itself is shifting in ways they cannot see. Sea levels are falling as ice expands. Rain patterns begin to change. Regions that were once fertile grow dry. Others become unpredictable. The balance of ecosystems starts to tilt, ever so slightly at first, then more noticeably. Pressure is building, not just in the environment, but deep within the Earth itself. Far to the east, beneath what we now call Sumatra, something ancient and immense is awakening. It has been forming for tens of thousands of years. A vast chamber of molten rock buried beneath layers of crust, growing slowly, silently. With each passing century, it expands. With each shift of tectonic plates, it is fed. Heat accumulates, pressure mounts. The rock above it strains under the force, bending, cracking in ways too subtle to be noticed on the surface. But this is no ordinary volcanic system. It is a supervolcano, capable of releasing energy on a scale that defies human comprehension. Underground, the magma chamber continues to swell, its boundaries pushing outward, searching for weakness. The surrounding rock begins to fracture, not in one place, but in many. Tiny ruptures form, then spread. Gas builds within the molten mass, increasing the internal pressure to levels that cannot be sustained forever. The Earth in this region is no longer stable. It is waiting. On the surface, life continues as it always has. Animals graze, humans hunt, gather, rest. The sky above remains unchanged, giving no hint of what lies beneath. There are no warning signs that could be understood, no signals that would mean anything to those living there. And yet the moment is approaching, not marked by a single instant, but by a threshold, an invisible line that once crossed cannot be undone. Then somewhere deep below, the pressure finally finds its release. At first, it is subtle. A fracture widens. Rock shifts. A tremor passes through the ground, not strong enough to destroy, but enough to signal that something is different. The crust begins to give way, not in a violent explosion, but in the earliest stage of collapse. The rupture has begun. It spreads through the earth like a crack in glass, branching, deepening, connecting hidden weaknesses into a single growing fault. The magma chamber, no longer contained, starts to force its way upward. Gases expand rapidly as pressure drops, accelerating the process. What was once confined is now in motion. On the surface, the signs are still ambiguous. Perhaps the ground trembles more frequently. Perhaps animals grow restless, sensing vibrations too subtle for human awareness. Perhaps there are sounds, low, distant, almost like thunder beneath the earth. But there is no clear warning, no moment where anyone can look to the horizon and understand what is coming. Because what is coming has never been seen before. Not by them, not by anything like them. This is not a storm that will pass, not a drought that will end, not a predator that can be avoided. This is something far older, far larger. A force built over geological time now reaching its breaking point. Beneath Sumatra, the Earth is no longer holding. It is beginning to fail. And as the fractures widen and the pressure surges upward, the first true signals of catastrophe start to emerge. Not yet visible across the world, not yet understood even at the source, but already irreversible. A process has begun that will darken the sky, cool the planet, and challenge the survival of every living thing. The world, for now, remains unaware, but it is no longer safe. And somewhere in the vast, scattered populations of early humans, lives continue as they always have. Hunts planned, fires lit, stories shared in the darkness, completely untouched by the knowledge that the ground beneath their feet and the sky above their heads are about to change forever. The question is not whether it will happen. It already has. The question is far more unsettling. When the first signs finally appeared, when the sky began to change, when the air grew strange, when the light itself started to fade, did anyone anywhere understand that they were witnessing the beginning of the end? Stay with us if you are interested in this journey. Also, keep sharing your thoughts in the comments section. There are moments in the history of this planet when the boundary between creation and destruction disappears. When the Earth ceases to be a stable world beneath our feet and reveals itself as something far more volatile. 74,000 years ago, that boundary broke. What began as a fracture deep beneath the surface did not remain hidden for long. Pressure that had been building for millennia surged upward with unstoppable force. The crust above it, once rigid and unyielding, gave way, not gradually but catastrophically. And then, the Earth opened. At the site of what we now call the Toba supervolcano, the surface did not simply erupt, it disintegrated. A column of fire, ash, and pulverized rock exploded upward with a violence that defies modern comparison. It did not rise like smoke from a fire. It tore into the sky, punching through the atmosphere with such force that it reached heights no storm has ever achieved. The sound alone would have been beyond comprehension, not a crack, not a roar, but something deeper, a sustained world-shaking detonation that rolled outward in all directions. It would have traveled across oceans, across continents, echoing through the air and the ground alike. For thousands of miles, the Earth itself would have seemed to tremble in response. Close to the eruption, nothing survived. Superheated avalanches of ash, gas, and rock, pyroclastic flows raced outward at terrifying speeds, faster than any animal could run. They consumed everything in their path. Forests vanished in seconds. Rivers boiled. Entire landscapes were buried beneath layers of burning debris, reshaped in moments into something unrecognizable. There was no escape, no warning that could have come in time. And still, this was only the beginning. As the eruption intensified, the scale of what was being released became almost impossible to grasp. Thousands of cubic kilometers of material were forced into the sky, rock shattered into dust, gases trapped for millennia suddenly freed. The column continued to rise, driven by heat and pressure, until it reached the upper layers of the atmosphere. There it began to spread, not as a localized cloud, but as a vast expanding veil. Ash fine as powder yet deadly in its reach, was carried by high-altitude winds across the planet. It drifted over the Indian Ocean across South Asia, reaching regions thousands of miles from its source. In some places, it would eventually settle in thick layers, coating the ground, suffocating ecosystems, altering landscapes for generations. But much of it did not fall. Instead, it lingered. Sulfur gases released during the eruption rose alongside the ash, entering the stratosphere where they underwent a transformation. There they formed tiny aerosol particles, reflective, persistent, and capable of altering the balance of the entire planet. These particles spread outward, encircling the globe. Within hours, the atmosphere itself was beginning to change. Sunlight, which had once traveled unobstructed to the surface, now encountered a barrier. Not a solid wall, but a diffuse growing haze that scattered and reflected its energy back into space. The brightness of day began to soften, almost imperceptibly at first. Shadows lost their sharpness. The sky took on a muted quality as though seen through a thin veil. Darkness did not fall all at once. It crept in. For those living far from the eruption, there would have been no immediate catastrophe, no wall of fire, no deafening explosion, only subtle changes, small enough to be dismissed, at least in the beginning. The sun seemed weaker. The air felt different. The rhythm of the world began to shift. Days passed and the changes became harder to ignore. The sky grew increasingly pale, its blue washed out by the presence of ash and aerosols high above. Sunrises and sunsets may have burned with strange, unnatural colors, deep reds and muted oranges, the result of light scattering through a thickening atmosphere. Temperatures began to fall. At first it was slight, a cooler morning, a shorter warmth at midday. But the trend did not reverse. Each passing week brought a subtle but persistent decline. The Earth was losing heat, its energy balance disrupted by the reflective shield now forming overhead. And unlike a storm, there was no movement toward resolution. This was not something that would pass in a few days. It was something that would endure. Across continents, ecosystems began to respond. Plants dependent on sunlight struggled under the diminished light. Growth slowed. In some regions, it stopped entirely. The delicate timing of seasons, so critical to the survival of both plants and animals, began to unravel. Rainfall patterns shifted as the atmosphere cooled. Monsoons weakened. Some regions experienced drought, others erratic and unpredictable weather. The stability upon which life depended was beginning to fracture, and still the full scale of the catastrophe had yet to reveal itself. High above in the stratosphere, the veil continued to thicken. Sulfur aerosols spread further, their reach now truly global. The process was self-sustaining for a time, as particles reflected sunlight, cooling the surface, which in turn altered atmospheric circulation in ways that prolonged their presence. The Earth was entering a new state, a volcanic winter. For early humans scattered across Africa and parts of Asia, the experience would have been deeply unsettling. They had no framework to understand what was happening, no concept of distant eruptions or atmospheric chemistry. Only observation and instinct. The world felt wrong. The warmth they depended on was fading. The patterns they relied upon were shifting. Food sources became less predictable. The balance between survival and starvation began to tilt. Yet there was no single moment of realization. No clear sign that this was the beginning of something catastrophic. Only a growing sense that the world was changing, and not for the better. Back at the source, the eruption did not cease quickly. It continued in phases, releasing more material, reinforcing the atmospheric effects already underway. The landscape around it was transformed beyond recognition. A vast caldera forming where the surface had collapsed, marking the site of one of the most powerful eruptions in Earth's history. But the true impact was no longer local, it was global. A chain reaction had been set in motion, one that would not end with fire but with cold. And as the sun continued to dim and the temperature continued to fall, a silent, invisible force began to take hold across the planet. Not an explosion, not a shockwave, but a slow, relentless descent into a world where life would become increasingly difficult to sustain. The eruption had done its work. Now the aftermath would begin. Days pass, and the sky does not return. At first, it is easy to believe that whatever has happened will fade, that the strange dimness in the air is temporary, like dust carried on the wind. But the days become weeks, and the weeks become months, and the world does not recover. The sky remains altered, muted, pale, as though the light itself has been thinned. High above, far beyond the reach of wind or rain, the ash from the Toba supervolcano lingers in the upper atmosphere. It does not fall in any meaningful way. It does not disperse as ordinary clouds do. Instead, it spreads, slowly, silently, until it forms a veil encircling the planet. Sunlight still arrives, but something is different. It is weaker, not dramatically at first, not enough to alarm perhaps in the earliest days. The difference is subtle, like the fading of a familiar color. Shadows soften. The brightness of midday loses its edge. The warmth that once settled over the land begins to hesitate, as though unsure of its place. Then the cooling begins, not as a sudden drop, but as a steady decline. A fraction of a degree here, another there, too small to notice in isolation, but relentless in its progression. The Earth, deprived of a portion of its incoming energy, begins to lose heat. And unlike the rhythms of ordinary seasons, this cooling does not reverse. Each day builds upon the last. Each night grows slightly colder. Across continents, the change takes hold with quiet inevitability. Regions that once supported dense vegetation begin to struggle. The delicate balance between sunlight, temperature, and moisture, so essential to plant life, starts to unravel. Rainfall patterns shift. The great monsoon systems, driven by the contrast between land and ocean temperatures, begin to weaken. The heat that once powered them is no longer sufficient. Rains arrive late, or not at all. In some places, they fall unpredictably, disrupting cycles that have persisted for thousands of years. Drought spreads. At first, it appears as a delay, then as a shortage, then as absence. Soils dry, rivers shrink, wetlands retreat into cracked earth. Plants, unable to adapt quickly enough, begin to fail. Leaves wither before their time. Growth slows, then halts. Entire regions that once thrived under reliable sunlight and rainfall begin to fade. And with the plants, everything else begins to follow. Herbivores dependent on vegetation find less to eat. Their migrations grow longer, more desperate. The herds that once moved with purpose now wander further, searching for sustenance that is no longer guaranteed. Many do not find it. Predators sense the change as well. Prey becomes scarce. The energy required to hunt increases even as the rewards diminish. Weakness spreads through populations that once stood at the top of their ecosystems. The chain of life, once resilient and self-sustaining, begins to fracture. And still, the sky does not clear. High in the stratosphere, sulfur gases released during the eruption have transformed into aerosols, tiny particles that reflect sunlight back into space. These particles persist far longer than ash alone. They are light enough to remain suspended, yet abundant enough to alter the balance of the entire planet. The effect is cumulative. The more sunlight they reflect, the more the surface cools. The more the surface cools, the more atmospheric circulation changes, allowing the aerosols to remain in place. A feedback loop, subtle but powerful, reinforces the new state of the world. The threshold is crossed quietly. There is no single moment when the Earth declares itself changed. No line drawn across the land to mark the transition. And yet, at some point, the difference becomes undeniable. Global temperatures have fallen by several degrees. In some regions, the drop is far more severe. What was once a stable climate has become something colder, harsher, less forgiving. Growing seasons shorten or vanish entirely. Frost appears in places where it was once rare. The margin for survival narrows for every living thing. The Earth has entered a volcanic winter. It is not a storm, and it is not a season, and it is a condition, a state in which the fundamental systems that support life, light, warmth, water, are all diminished at once. For early humans, the experience is not measured in degrees or atmospheric models. It is felt in hunger and uncertainty, in the slow disappearance of the world they understood. The animals they once hunted become harder to find. The plants they once gathered no longer grow in the same abundance. Familiar landscapes change in ways that cannot be explained. The sky remains dim, the air remains cool, and there is no indication that it will return to what it was. There are no stories to explain this, no inherited knowledge of such an event. Nothing in their past experience prepares them for a world where the sun itself seems unreliable. And so they adapt as they always have, by moving, by searching, by enduring. But adaptation has limits, because this is not a localized hardship, it is global. From Africa to Asia, from coastlines to inland plains, the effects ripple outward. Some regions suffer more than others. Some ecosystems collapse faster. But nowhere is entirely untouched. Even the oceans, vast and seemingly resilient, begin to feel the change. Surface temperatures drop. Marine ecosystems shift. The delicate balance that supports life beneath the waves is altered, though not as immediately or as severely as on land. Still, it is enough to matter. Because on land, the situation continues to worsen. Years begin to pass, and still, the sky does not clear. The aerosols persist longer than expected. The cooling remains. The systems that once regulated the planet struggle to regain equilibrium. Life continues, but under strain, reduced, weakened, forced into new patterns. The world has not ended, but it has been transformed. And in that transformation, a silent pressure is placed upon every species that inhabits it. Adapt or disappear. For humanity, small and scattered as it is, the challenge is immense. Their numbers are already low, their existence already precarious. Now they face a world in which survival is no longer just difficult, but uncertain. Some groups will endure, others will not, and the difference between them may come down to something as simple and as fragile as where they happen to be when the world begins to fail. Because in a volcanic winter, survival is not evenly distributed. It is a matter of geography, of chance, of being in the right place, at the right time. And as the years of dimmed sunlight stretch on, one question begins to take shape, unspoken but unavoidable. Not how powerful this event has been, not how far its effects will reach, but something far more fundamental. How long can a world continue when the very light it depends on has begun to fade? Years pass, and still the warmth does not return. There is no moment of recovery, no sudden clearing of the sky, no triumphant return of sunlight breaking through the haze. Instead, the world settles into something unfamiliar, something diminished. The light that reaches the surface is weaker now, filtered through a lingering veil that refuses to lift. The days feel shorter, even when they are not. The air carries a persistent chill, as though the planet itself has forgotten how to be warm. If there were words to describe it, they would come much later. In the distant future, humanity would witness another eruption, 1815. Mount Tambora eruption, an event powerful enough to disrupt weather across the globe. Crops would fail, summers would vanish, snow would fall in months where it did not belong, entire societies would feel the strain of a single year without warmth. But that would be 1 year. This is something else entirely, and this is not a disruption of seasons, this is the erasure of them. The sunlight that once drove the rhythms of life has been reduced dramatically, perhaps by as much as 90% in the most affected regions. What remains is not darkness, but a muted, weakened glow that lacks the energy to sustain the world as it once did. Photosynthesis falters. Growth slows to a near halt. Entire growing seasons pass without renewal. Forests begin to thin. At first, the change is subtle. Leaves emerge later, fall earlier. Trees struggle to maintain their cycles. Then gradually the stress becomes visible. Branches die back. Entire stands of vegetation fail to regenerate. What once was dense and vibrant becomes sparse and fragile. Grasslands, too, begin to fade. These vast ecosystems, dependent on predictable sunlight and rainfall, cannot sustain themselves under the new conditions. Grasses wither before they can fully grow. The endless plains that once fed countless herds begin to shrink, breaking apart into patches of diminishing life. And as the plants fail, the animals begin to starve. Herbivores, once abundant, now face a world where food is no longer reliable. Their migrations grow erratic. They travel farther, expend more energy, and find less in return. The weakest fall first, the young, the old, the injured. But as conditions worsen, even the strong cannot keep up. Carcasses become more common. But even death offers only temporary relief. Predators, too, begin to weaken. With prey scarce and competition increasing, hunting becomes more dangerous, less predictable. Energy is spent without guarantee of reward. Injuries that once might have healed now become fatal. The balance that once defined the relationship between hunter and hunted begins to collapse. This is not a sudden die-off. It is slower than that. More insidious, because there is no single moment when life ends. No event that marks the boundary between survival and extinction. Instead, there is a gradual unraveling, a steady reduction in numbers, in diversity, and resilience, an invisible pressure tightening over time. The ecosystems do not collapse all at once. They fade, and in that fading, something far more dangerous emerges: uncertainty. For early humans, this is unlike anything they have ever faced. They have known droughts. They have known harsh seasons, scarcity, danger. But these challenges have always been temporary. There has always been a return, a shift in the environment that allows recovery, that restores balance. This time it does not come. The familiar patterns are gone. The places that once provided food no longer do. The animals they relied upon disappear or move unpredictably. Water sources shrink or vanish. The knowledge passed down through generations of where to go, when to hunt, what to gather, begins to lose its reliability. And without that knowledge, survival becomes far more difficult. There is no enemy to confront, no storm to outlast, no predator to fight, only a world that is slowly withdrawing its support for life. Groups begin to fracture under the strain. Resources that were once shared become scarce enough to compete over. Movement becomes constant, driven not by choice but by necessity. Each decision carries greater risk, each mistake greater consequence. And all the while the sky remains unchanged, dim, distant, unresponsive. There is no sign that the world is healing, no indication that the warmth will return. And so the struggle continues, not against a single event, but against a condition that persists day after day, year after year. A slow, invisible extinction. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a single blow. It unfolds gradually, reducing populations not through catastrophe but through attrition. One group fails here, another dwindles there. Entire regions become uninhabitable, not because they are suddenly destroyed, but because they can no longer sustain life. From a distance, it might not even be noticeable. The planet still turns. The sun still rises and sets. Life continues in a diminished form. But beneath that surface, the numbers are falling. And for a species as small and scattered as early humans, that decline is dangerous. Because there is a threshold, a point beyond which recovery becomes uncertain. and no one living through this moment would know how close they are to crossing it. The most unsettling aspect of this world is not its violence, but its silence. There are no explosions now, no dramatic events to mark the passing of time, only the quiet absence of what once was, the absence of abundance, the absence of stability, the absence of certainty. It is a world where survival becomes a question asked every day and answered less confidently with each passing year. And yet, even in this diminished state, life does not disappear entirely. Some regions hold on longer than others. Some ecosystems prove more resilient. And within the human population, there are those who adapt, who find ways to endure despite the collapsing world around them. But they are fewer now, far fewer. And as the years of cold and dim light stretch on, a realization begins to take shape, not in words, but in experience. This is not temporary. This is the new world. And the question is no longer when it will end, but who, if anyone, will still be here when it does. What are your thoughts about this journey? Share with us in the comments section. There is no single moment when life collapses, no final signal, no dividing line between a living world and a dying one. Instead, it unravels, quietly at first, then everywhere. The balance that once held ecosystems together begins to loosen thread by thread. Relationships built over thousands of years between plant and soil, animal and prey, climate and growth start to fail under the pressure of a world that no longer behaves as it should. Inland regions feel it first. Far from the stabilizing influence of the oceans, these landscapes depend entirely on fragile cycles of sunlight and rain. When those cycles break, there is nothing to soften the impact. The cooling air, the weakened sunlight, the collapsing rainfall patterns all converge here with devastating precision. Grasslands that once stretched endlessly begin to thin, then fragment. Patches of green shrink into isolated pockets surrounded by dry, lifeless earth. The soil hardens, seeds fail to germinate. What once was a continuous ecosystem becomes a scattering of remnants. And without stable plant life, the herbivores begin to vanish. At first they move. Driven by instinct, they search for better conditions, following ancient migration routes that once guaranteed survival. But those routes no longer lead to abundance. They lead to more scarcity, more uncertainty. Herds grow smaller, weaker, less coordinated. The young struggle to survive the journey. The old cannot keep up, and eventually even the strong begin to fail. Carcasses mark the landscape, silent evidence of a system that can no longer sustain itself. The great movements of life that once defined these regions begin to slow, then stop altogether. And when the herbivores disappear, the carnivores follow. Predators are among the most sensitive to imbalance. Their survival depends on the health of the populations they hunt. As prey becomes scarce, competition intensifies. Territory expands beyond sustainable limits. Hunts become longer, riskier, often unsuccessful. Energy is spent and not recovered. Injuries accumulate, weakness spreads. One by one, the apex hunters, the creatures that once ruled their environments, begin to fade from the landscape, not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet failure. A missed hunt, a lingering wound, a final attempt that does not succeed. The hierarchy of life collapses from the bottom up and from the top down. In Africa, the sky reflects the change. By day, it carries a dull gray pallor. Sunlight filtered through layers of ash and aerosols that still linger high above. The brightness of the world is muted, as though seen through a veil that never lifts. By night, the sky glows with an unnatural red. Not the deep, comforting hues of a sunset, but something more persistent, a reflection of particles suspended in the atmosphere, scattering what little light remains. It is a sky that feels altered, unfamiliar, a constant reminder that the world is no longer what it was. For those who live beneath it, there is no explanation, only the growing certainty that something is wrong. In Asia, the devastation takes a different form. Here, the proximity to the eruption has left a more immediate scar. Ash blankets vast regions of land, settling in layers thick enough to transform entire landscapes. Rivers are choked, vegetation is smothered, the ground itself becomes hostile to life. What once supported forests and grasslands becomes barren, uninhabitable. In these regions, the collapse is not gradual, it is abrupt. Ecosystems are buried beneath the weight of volcanic debris. Recovery, if it comes at all, will take generations. And so, the planet begins to divide, not into continents or climates, but into zones. Zones of survival and zones of death. In some places, conditions remain just stable enough to support life. The cooling is less severe. The rainfall, though diminished, still arrives. Vegetation clings to existence, and with it, the animals that depend on it. In others, the collapse is nearly complete. There, life does not adapt. It disappears. These zones are not defined by clear boundaries. They shift, expand, contract. What is survivable one year may not be the next. What offers refuge today may fail tomorrow. The map of life becomes unstable, constantly changing under the influence of a disrupted planet. And within this fractured world, humanity faces its greatest test. Small groups of early humans, already scattered and vulnerable, find themselves caught in a landscape that no longer supports them as it once did. Their survival depends not only on skill or intelligence, but on location, on whether they happen to exist within one of the few regions where life can still endure. Some groups find themselves in zones of collapse. For them, the outcome is almost inevitable. Food becomes scarce, water unreliable, movement constant. Each day brings new challenges, each more difficult than the last. There are no reserves, no safety nets. When resources run out, there is nowhere else to go, and so they begin to disappear. Not all at once, not in a single event that could be witnessed or remembered, but gradually, quietly, as one group fails, then another, then another. Entire lineages vanish without a trace, no record, no memory, only absence, but not everywhere. In other regions, those rare pockets where the environment remains just stable enough, humans endure. They adapt to the changing conditions, shifting their behaviors, their diets, their movements. They rely on what remains available, finding ways to survive in a world that offers less with each passing year. These groups become isolated, separated not by distance alone, but by the conditions that surround them. Between one surviving population and another may lie vast stretches of uninhabitable land. Barriers not of geography, but of survival itself. Humanity, once scattered but connected, becomes fragmented, reduced. And as this process continues, something profound begins to happen. The total number of humans on the planet starts to fall. Not dramatically at first, not in a way that would be immediately noticeable. But over time, the decline becomes undeniable. Fewer groups, fewer individuals, less diversity. A species that was already small becomes smaller still, and yet even in this collapse, there is no final moment, no point where humanity disappears entirely. Because survival, like extinction, is not evenly distributed. It depends on chance, on geography, on being in the right place when the world begins to fail. And so, while many are lost, some remain, scattered across the surviving zones of life, holding on in ways they do not fully understand, adapting to a world that no longer resembles the one their ancestors knew. They do not know how many are left. They do not know how close they are to disappearing. But they continue, because they must, and in that fragile persistence lies the possibility that humanity, despite everything, will not end here. The world has fractured, life has diminished, and entire ecosystems have collapsed. And somewhere within that silence, humanity has begun to fade, but not completely, not yet. In a world unraveling under dim skies and failing ecosystems, there are places where life does not collapse completely. Not untouched, not unchanged, but stable enough to endure. Small pockets scattered across the planet where the balance, though strained, does not break. These are the places where the story of humanity does not end. They are rare, fragile, almost invisible against the scale of the catastrophe unfolding around them. But they exist, and in them, life persists. Along the southern edges of Africa, where land meets the vast restless ocean, the conditions are different. The cooling that grips the interior does not strike here with the same severity. The air, though altered, carries a hint of moderation. The temperature shifts are softened by the presence of the sea, which absorbs and releases heat more slowly than the land. It is not a return to what once was, but it is enough. The ocean, vast and resilient, continues to provide, while inland ecosystems falter under weakened sunlight and collapsing rainfall. The coastal waters maintain a form of stability. Nutrient cycles persist beneath the surface. Marine life adapts more readily to the cooling conditions. Shellfish cling to rocks in tidal zones, nourished by currents that still move, still sustain. Here, food does not vanish completely. It changes, but it remains. For early humans who find themselves in these regions, the difference is profound. Where others face starvation, they discover a resource that endures. The rhythm of the tides replaces the uncertainty of the land. With each retreat of the water, the shoreline reveals what can be gathered: shellfish, small marine creatures, life that does not depend as directly on sunlight as the plants of the interior. It is not abundance, but it is reliable, and in a world where reliability has all but disappeared, that is everything. At a place we now call Pinnacle Point overlooking the Indian Ocean, this fragile balance becomes visible in the traces left behind. Here, humans do not vanish. They remain. Evidence uncovered tens of thousands of years later reveals something remarkable. Layers of sediment beneath, within, and above the ash deposited from the distant eruption contain signs of continuous human presence. Not interruption, not abandonment, continuity. Stone tools shaped with increasing precision, fragments of bone, evidence of hunted animals, traces of fire controlled and sustained, hundreds of thousands of artifacts, each one a quiet declaration that life continued here when it failed elsewhere. These were not people merely clinging to existence. They were adapting. Fire, once a tool of survival, becomes something more refined. It is used deliberately to cook, to process materials, to alter the properties of stone itself. Heat-treated tools emerge, stronger and more effective than those that came before. Innovation does not stop in the face of hardship. It accelerates. Because in a world that has become less forgiving, the margin for error has narrowed. Every advantage matters. Every improvement increases the chance of survival, however slightly. And so these small groups learn. They observe the tides. They understand the rhythms of the shoreline. They exploit resources that others living inland may never have known existed. Their knowledge becomes specialized, tied to a place that offers them what the rest of the world no longer can. They adapt not just physically, but behaviorally. Social bonds strengthen. Cooperation becomes essential. The sharing of resources, the transmission of knowledge, the coordination of effort, these are no longer optional. They are the difference between survival and disappearance. And so, they remain. While vast regions of the planet slip into decline, these pockets of humanity persist, isolated but enduring. They do not know the scale of what is happening beyond their immediate world. They cannot see the collapse unfolding across continents. They do not know how many others still exist. For all they know, they may be alone, and yet they continue. There are likely others scattered across different refuges, coastal regions, areas less affected by the cooling, places where the environment, by chance or by geography, has not reached the same level of collapse. In parts of Africa, perhaps in sections of Asia, small groups hold on, each adapting in their own way to the conditions around them. But they are few, far fewer than before. Humanity, once spread thin across the landscape, is now fragmented into isolated pockets, separated by vast stretches of uninhabitable land. The connections that may once have existed between groups are broken. Movement becomes dangerous, often impossible. Survival depends on staying within the narrow boundaries of what still works. The world has not ended, but it has narrowed, and within that narrowing, only certain paths remain. What is perhaps most remarkable is not simply that these humans survive, but that they do so without understanding the magnitude of their situation. They do not know that their species may be approaching a critical threshold. They do not know that their numbers have likely fallen dramatically. They do not know that they may represent a significant portion of all humans left on Earth. They are simply living, hunting when they can, gathering when the tides allow, protecting their young, learning, adapting, enduring, unaware that they are carrying something far greater than their own survival, the future. Because in these small, scattered groups in places like Pinnacle Point, the continuity of humanity is preserved. Not through intention, not through design, but through circumstance, through geography, through the quiet resilience of life finding a way to persist in the face of overwhelming change. They are not the strongest, not the most advanced, not the most numerous. They are simply the ones who remained. And as the years pass, as the skies slowly begin to change and the world inches toward recovery, these survivors will become something more than just remnants of a fading population. They will become the foundation, the ancestors of every human who will ever live. Their struggles, their adaptations, their decisions made without knowledge of their significance will shape the trajectory of a species that, against all odds, did not disappear. In a world that fractured into zones of survival and death, they found the narrow space where life could continue. And in doing so, they ensured that humanity, though reduced, though scattered, though nearly lost, would endure. Eventually, the world begins to shift. The sky, once a persistent veil of ash and aerosols, starts to thin. Not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, imperceptibly at first, as if the atmosphere itself is exhaling after a long, suffocating hold. Sunlight, once muted and weak, begins to regain its strength. The chill that had lingered across continents begins to ease. Day by day, season by season, warmth returns to the surface of the Earth. The oceans, which had absorbed so much of the disruption, slowly resume their role as stabilizers, feeding moisture back into the air, helping to regenerate rainfall and tempering extremes of temperature. Yet even as the climate begins to regain equilibrium, the planet itself has been irrevocably changed. Ecosystems do not return to their previous form. Forests that once stretched uninterrupted across valleys remain patchy, fragmented, or replaced entirely by shrubs and hardier plant species that could tolerate the cooler, drier conditions. Grasslands, diminished by the lack of sunlight and prolonged drought, struggle to reclaim their former expanses. Some species, unable to adapt to these new environmental pressures, vanish entirely. Others migrate, their ranges shifting as the post-eruption climate favors different conditions. Life moves on, yes, but it moves on altered, fragile, and wary. In the northern continents, where ice sheets had already been creeping forward, the volcanic winter has compounded the effects of the glacial cycles. Glaciers advance in some regions, retreat in others, leaving a mosaic of unstable landscapes, rivers swollen in some valleys, choked with sediment in others. The continents themselves seem unfamiliar to those who survive, reshaped not just by the slow march of ice, but by the sudden shock of fire, ash, and cooling from a distant eruption. The world's rhythms have been disrupted. What was once predictable is no longer so. Africa, by contrast, shows a strange resilience. Coastal regions in the south and along the Indian Ocean, where humans had survived in relative safety, begin to recover more quickly. The plants and animals there had endured less extreme cold, fewer crop failures, and more consistent rainfall than in inland or northern regions. Yet even here, the landscape carries scars. Ash layers remain in the soil, buried in places like Pinnacle Point, preserving the memory of the eruption for tens of thousands of years. Water sources that had been disrupted slowly refill, rivers regain their courses, and the coastlines resume their ancient patterns. But these recoveries are uneven, leaving isolated refuges where life can continue and wide swaths where it cannot. It is in these pockets of resilience that humanity begins to re-emerge, though not as it had been before. The species that once roamed vast landscapes in scattered but numerous groups is now diminished, fragmented, reduced in both number and genetic diversity. Populations that had survived the harshest years of the volcanic winter find themselves isolated from each other, separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles of territory now uninhabitable or hostile. Where before a tribe could encounter others along migration routes, now survival often means avoiding the wastelands entirely, remaining within a narrow zone that can sustain life. In these zones, humans begin to adapt to a world forever altered. Their tools, once simple, become more refined and specialized. Heat treatment of stone, careful preparation of fire, exploitation of marine resources. All innovations that may have existed before the eruption now become essential to survival. They hunt differently, gather differently, and organize their social structures more deliberately. Life has become more difficult, but necessity breeds ingenuity. Every decision carries weight. Every adaptation increases the odds of enduring in a planet that is still unpredictable and fragile. Genetic studies suggest the scale of this bottleneck is profound. Modern humans carry the imprint of this catastrophe in their DNA. Analysis reveals that all contemporary humans may descend from a population numbering only a few thousand individuals, a stark reduction from pre-eruption numbers. Variability in our genetic code shows signs of a near-extinction event, a collapse that left only a fraction of early humans to repopulate the world. Some scientists, including Stanley Ambrose, have argued that the eruption may have caused a genetic bottleneck, with profound implications for the species' evolution. The survivors were not chosen for their strength, their skill, or their knowledge, but for the accident of geography, the regions in which they happened to endure. Yet these survivors are remarkable not merely for their endurance, but for what they accomplish in spite of the devastation around them. Coastal refuges, such as the southern African shoreline, become cradles of innovation and continuity. Here, the human population develops and maintains technological practices that will influence generations to come. Archaeological evidence from Pinnacle Point shows a continuous occupation through and beyond the eruption, with thousands of artifacts revealing the use of fire, advanced tools, and careful exploitation of marine resources. These people, though few in number, carry forward the lineage of modern humans, a lineage that had once teetered on the edge of extinction. Across the planet, the survivors begin to reclaim some semblance of mobility. Migration patterns slowly restart, but now constrained by the new geography of survival, where vast forests and plains once permitted free movement. The post-eruption landscape is patchwork. Harsh expanses, fragmented refuges, and corridors that support life tenuously. Human populations remain scattered, each group operating within these corridors, sometimes connecting with others across great distances, sometimes isolated for generations. The emotional and psychological pressures of this era are unimaginable. Humans faced years of famine, cold, and uncertainty. They witnessed the collapse of the life forms they relied upon. Social structures that had existed for centuries were strained to breaking. Children born during these years would grow up in a world where survival depended not on chance alone, but on careful attention to the environment, on learned strategies passed down through families, on constant awareness of risk. And yet, in the midst of this struggle, there is persistence. Life continues, sometimes surprisingly robust. Where inland ecosystems collapse completely, coastal zones, river valleys, and sheltered areas remain viable. Small human populations endure, maintaining knowledge, culture, and a continuity that will allow the species to rebound when conditions permit. The Earth, though forever changed, is still habitable. The survivors are testament not only to resilience, but to the unpredictable nature of life in the face of catastrophe. The world after the ash is both familiar and alien. It is recognizable, yes, oceans, rivers, coastlines, but altered in ways that will shape evolution, migration, and survival for millennia. Entire species have been reduced or eliminated. Habitats have shifted. The humans who endure are the custodians of a future they cannot yet imagine, carrying within them the genetic echoes of catastrophe and survival. Humanity has become a shadow of what it once was, diminished not only in numbers but in distribution, isolated in ecological refuges where the planet has allowed them to persist. And yet, it is within this small, resilient population that the seeds of the future lie. The survivors of the Toba eruption, scattered and few, represent the narrow channel through which the continuity of our species has flowed, a testament to endurance against the most profound odds, a living bridge from a nearly lost past to the future that will emerge from it. The world is changed. Humanity is changed. The ash has settled, but the memory of what it wrought lingers in every forest, every coastline, every strand of human DNA. The survivors have endured, carrying forward not only their own lives, but the potential of the species as a whole. And the story of how they did so, the strategies, the adaptations, the sheer determination, will echo across millennia, waiting for future generations to uncover it, understand it, and marvel at it. What do you think about this? Share with our community. Imagine being one of them. Imagine standing on the edge of a world that has been fractured, diminished, and scorched, not by human hands, but by forces beyond comprehension. The sky is clearer now, but the memory of darkness and cold lingers in every bone, every instinct. The ground beneath your feet is littered with reminders of what once was. Bones of prey animals that never returned, fragments of trees that will not grow again, scorched earth where once there was abundance. You do not know what caused the darkness. You cannot see the distant eruption, the mountain that erupted tens of thousands of miles away, sending fire, ash, and sulfur into the stratosphere. You only feel the consequences, the chilling air that persists longer than it should, the shortened seasons, the scarcity of food, the uncertainty that hangs over each day like a shadow. You do not know if it will return. Will the sun fade again? Will the rains fail? Will another wave of catastrophe sweep through the lands you have begun to call home? The unknown presses against you heavier than any predator. Your group is smaller now. Once there may have been dozens, perhaps hundreds of families across the region, connected by migration routes and trade. Now numbers have dwindled. Survivors are scattered. Many have perished along the way, children, elders, hunters lost to hunger, disease, or accidents. The old social structures, once robust, are fractured. Bonds that could have ensured support are weakened by loss. Your community is weaker, scarred. The old world is gone. There are no vast herds to follow, no dense forests to hide within, no predictability in the seasons. The landscapes have been altered beyond recognition. Rivers have shifted, coastlines have changed. Areas that once teemed with life are now barren or dangerously unpredictable, and so survival is no longer something taken for granted. The simplicity of previous life, the patterns that guided hunting, gathering, and movement, has vanished. This is not just survival. It is something deeper. It is rebuilding from near nothing. Each day carries weight. Every decision can mean life or death. Every hunt, every gathering trip, every fire made, every shelter maintained is a test of judgment, skill, and endurance. Mistakes are costly. Knowledge is precious. Stories taught by elders become critical maps of memory, instructions for navigating a world that has been abruptly rewritten. And in this struggle, something begins to change in humans. Cooperation deepens. It is no longer optional to share resources or to coordinate group effort. Food scarcity makes competition within the group deadly. Survival demands collaboration. Those who hoard, who act selfishly, weaken the community. Cooperation becomes a survival strategy. Sharing shellfish, meat, or firewood ensures the persistence of the group. Communication, once limited to immediate survival needs, now expands into careful teaching, deliberate guidance, and warning systems. Knowledge of tides, prey behavior, and seasonal changes becomes a shared responsibility. The social fabric strengthens because it must. Weak bonds can no longer persist. Innovation increases. Necessity drives invention. Tools become more sophisticated, not for status or display, but to ensure survival. Heat-treated stones, sharpened for better hunting, fish hooks and nets fashioned for marine resources. Fire used not just for warmth, but to process food more efficiently and to protect against the cold and predators. Adaptation is not merely reactive, it becomes deliberate. The environment is unpredictable, so humans respond with foresight, experimentation, and careful observation. Patterns are studied, lessons are internalized. Each incremental improvement is the difference between life and death. Behavior shifts. Humans begin to plan further into the future than ever before, caching food, creating seasonal strategies, learning from the successes and failures of other groups. Migration is no longer random. It is deliberate, calculated, and informed by memory and observation. Hunting strategies evolve to conserve energy and maximize efficiency. Group hierarchies, previously flexible, solidify to ensure order in a world where chaos is everywhere. Cultural behaviors, rituals, social norms, and cooperative codes emerge as mechanisms to stabilize communities under stress. These changes are not conscious theories of survival. They are learned behaviors honed by necessity. In these fragile, scattered refuges, humans also begin to display early forms of problem-solving on a scale we would later recognize as uniquely our own. The crisis forces abstract thought. The unpredictability of prey, the variability of tides, the complexity of shelter in new climates. These demands create a cognitive pressure unlike anything before. Those who can anticipate outcomes, understand cause and effect, and communicate solutions gain an advantage. Intelligence is no longer merely a tool for curiosity or play. It becomes a weapon against extinction. Memory itself grows in value. Stories of danger and survival are preserved, passed down from elders to children. Each narrative carries lessons about resource locations, animal behavior, and environmental hazards. In a landscape transformed by catastrophe, forgetting can be deadly. Cultural continuity, once perhaps incidental, now becomes a lifeline. Language and symbolism, gestures and rituals all begin to crystallize in the crucible of survival. Humans are forced to externalize knowledge in ways that endure across generations. Yet even with cooperation and innovation, life is perilous. Every season brings uncertainty. A coastal storm might wash away vital food caches. An unseasonable drought might kill shellfish or drive prey inland. Diseases previously manageable strike harder when nutrition is scarce and the group is weakened. The environment is unforgiving, indifferent, and relentless. Fear, stress, and grief are constant companions. Every generation grows up in a shadowed world, aware instinctively of the fragility of existence. And still, humans endure, not as they once were, not in great numbers, not across vast territories. But here, in these narrow bands of survival, they continue to live, to learn, and to adapt. These small groups scattered along coastlines or near sheltered valleys are more than survivors. They are innovators, teachers, learners. They are the living bridge between the near extinction wrought by the Toba eruption and the eventual resurgence of the species. It is within this crucible, forged from scarcity and uncertainty, that something profound begins to crystallize. Humanity becomes resilient not simply because of strength or luck, but because of behavior shaped by extreme necessity. Collaboration, foresight, innovation, cultural memory, these traits honed by the volcanic winter will echo through tens of thousands of years. In this diminished world, survival is no longer guaranteed. Every day is a test of adaptability, and yet the human species persists, carrying forward not just life, but the capacity to change, to create, to endure. The survivors of the Toba catastrophe are more than remnants. They are the seedbed for the future. From this near extinction, humanity learns something fundamental. Survival depends not only on the strength of the body, but on the strength of the mind, the ingenuity of the individual, and the cohesion of the group. The human condition is reshaped in the crucible of disaster. And it is here, in this fragile and terrifying landscape, that the story of our species' resilience truly begins to take root. Tens of thousands of years after the skies above Sumatra cleared, long after the oceans had calmed and the forests slowly began to reclaim the scorched earth, a different kind of discovery emerged. One that did not involve fire, ash, or stone, but something far more intimate. Hidden deep within the blueprint of life itself, encoded in the DNA of every human being alive today, lay a story written not in sand or rock, but in nucleotides and chromosomes. A story of survival, of collapse, and of a species that had teetered on the edge of extinction and somehow endured. For decades, scientists studying human genetics noticed a perplexing pattern. Across continents, across cultures, across populations that had long been separated by oceans, mountains, and deserts, genetic variation seemed unusually low. Humans as a species appeared far more uniform than expected. Other mammals with similar population sizes and dispersal patterns exhibited far greater diversity. Why were we so genetically constrained? What event could have reduced the richness of our genetic library so profoundly? The answer, as it slowly became clear, pointed to a moment of catastrophic contraction in our history. Somewhere in the deep past, the number of humans alive at one time had plummeted drastically. Not for a decade, not for a generation, but long enough to leave a lasting imprint on every human genome. This was not a local disaster. It was not a famine in one valley or a disease confined to one region. This was a collapse of global proportions, one that left only a few thousand individuals to carry forward the entire lineage of Homo sapiens. Scientists call this a genetic bottleneck. Just as water forced through the narrow neck of a bottle loses all but a fraction of its original flow, a population reduced to a few thousand individuals loses nearly all of its previous genetic variation. Traits that had once been diverse become rare. Genetic mutations that had existed for millennia vanish. The human gene pool, which had once been broad and vibrant, contracts into a narrow, fragile corridor. The Toba super-eruption, that monstrous explosion of fire and ash 74,000 years ago, emerged as the most compelling candidate for this bottleneck. Researchers such as Stanley Ambrose had suggested decades earlier that this cataclysmic event could have plunged early humans into near extinction, drastically reducing population size and leaving only scattered pockets of survival. Yet for years, the evidence was circumstantial. Archaeological sites existed on the coasts of Africa, like Pinnacle Point showing continuous occupation, while other regions offered little trace of human presence. Could a single eruption have caused a near-global collapse? Or was it one of several stresses that coincided in a particularly vulnerable moment in human history? The genetic evidence, increasingly sophisticated with the advent of high-throughput sequencing, offered a striking answer. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child revealed a startling uniformity among all living humans. The diversity was consistent with a population that had fallen to mere thousands of individuals. Nuclear DNA told a similar story. Patterns of mutation, recombination, and inheritance all pointed to a severe bottleneck roughly aligned with the timing of the Toba eruption. For the first time, the molecular record seemed to mirror the archaeological record, a world of scarce, isolated survivors clinging to existence while most of humanity disappeared. Modern research deepens the picture further. Geneticists examine segments of DNA called microsatellites, repeating sequences that mutate at a predictable rate. The patterns in these sequences indicate not just a reduction in population, but a loss of diversity so extreme it would take tens of thousands of years to recover. Entire lineages of early humans vanish in the data, leaving only the survivors to seed the future. Every human alive today carries fragments of these survivors' genomes. Every gene, every protein-coding sequence, every small regulatory region is a testament to the endurance of a few over the many who perished. Yet the story is not merely one of loss. Within the bottleneck lies the seed of humanity's resilience. The survivors were forced into extreme adaptation as they had to contend with collapsing ecosystems, scarce food, and unpredictable climates. Evolution in this crucible may have favored cognitive flexibility, cooperation, and social cohesion, the very traits that would allow our species not only to endure but to eventually thrive across the globe. Natural selection acted more intensely, refining survival traits in a concentrated population. In this way, the bottleneck, horrific as it was, may have shaped the human species in ways that continue to define us. The DNA also preserves subtler hints of migration and connectivity. Even within this small surviving population, genetic markers reveal that groups were not entirely isolated. They moved, they exchanged mates across distances, they maintained a fragile web of gene flow that prevented total genetic collapse. Coastal refuges in southern Africa and possibly other safe havens across the Indian Ocean rim became the arteries through which humanity endured. The ocean itself, once merely a provider of food, now emerges in the genetic record as a conduit of survival. Pathways along which the threads of humanity were preserved. Intriguingly, the genetic evidence also illuminates the randomness of survival. It was not intelligence alone that determined who persisted. It was not superior strength, nor the possession of advanced tools. Geography, timing, and luck played an overwhelming role. Those who happened to occupy the right refuges, who found stable food sources, who avoided disease outbreaks, were the ones whose DNA flows through our veins today. Every one of us carries this legacy, a living reminder that life, even human life, is shaped as much by circumstance as by choice. This genetic bottleneck is not merely a curiosity for laboratories or a footnote in evolutionary biology. It reframes the story of humanity itself. It forces us to recognize that our species, despite its current dominance across the planet, once hovered perilously close to extinction. Tens of thousands of years ago, we were not countless, not distributed, not secure. We were few, we were fragile, we were survivors in the literal sense of the word. Even more astonishing is that these survivors left a lasting imprint not just on our genes, but on our capacity for survival itself. Traits honed in the shadows of the Toba eruption, cooperation, foresight, innovation, adaptability, became encoded not only behaviorally but genetically, passed down through generations as part of the human condition. The DNA of every human carries not just the blueprint of anatomy, but the memory of survival under extreme stress, of life preserved against overwhelming odds. As scientists continue to decode the human genome, the echoes of Toba remain evident. Tiny mutations, rare alleles, genetic drift, all tell the story of a world reshaped by catastrophe, and a species compressed into a narrow corridor of existence. Through these molecular fingerprints, the eruption is not just an event of the past. It is a force that continues to define who we are, encoded in every cell of our bodies, in every heartbeat, in every strand of hair. The revelation is both humbling and unsettling. Humbling because it shows the narrowness of the path through which humanity passed. Unsettling because it reminds us of the fragility inherent in our species, the randomness of survival, and the thin line between existence and oblivion. And yet, within this genetic record lies a story of endurance, of resilience, of ingenuity. The story of a few thousand survivors whose lives became the foundation for every human being alive today. By looking inward into the very essence of our biology, we uncover not only the history of an eruption, but the history of ourselves. The ash and fire of Toba, which seemed so distant in time and space, now finds a permanent witness within us. Every gene, every sequence, every minute variation carries with it the memory of a world nearly lost, and the improbable triumph of those who endured. And as we gaze at this genetic landscape, we begin to realize something profound, that humanity's story is not only written in the earth, the ash, or the artifacts left behind, but within us, inscribed in code that has survived 74,000 years of catastrophe, change, and adaptation. A story of collapse, survival, and the extraordinary resilience of life itself. Isn't it amazing? Share your feelings in the comments section. Anthropologist Stanley Ambrose's proposition is as audacious as it is haunting. That the Toba supereruption, which spewed unimaginable volumes of ash and rock into the sky, may have reduced the entire human population to only a few thousand individuals. Perhaps even as few as 1,000 breeding adults, scattered in isolated pockets of the world, clinging desperately to survival where conditions allowed. This is not merely a theory about numbers. It is a theory about the fragility of our species, a theory that suggests humanity once existed on a razor's edge, its continuity hinging on the endurance of a handful of survivors. To grasp the magnitude of this, one must understand what the world looked like at that time. 74,000 years ago, humans were not the ubiquitous, technologically dominant species we recognize today. They were small groups of hunter-gatherers, fragile and scattered, dependent entirely on the whims of nature. A prolonged disruption in climate could wipe out entire bands within months, and the eruption of Toba did exactly that, a cataclysm that did not discriminate between skill, intelligence, or luck. Only those who happened to occupy coastal refuges or other ecologically buffered zones survived. Ambrose's theory, first proposed in the late 1990s, arose from the analysis of modern human genetic diversity. Using mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lineage, Ambrose and his colleagues noticed an alarming uniformity. Across Africa, Asia, Europe, and beyond, genetic variation was far lower than expected for a species that had already dispersed across multiple continents. Such uniformity suggested a bottleneck of unprecedented severity, a dramatic contraction of population numbers. The most parsimonious explanation for this reduction in diversity, Ambrose argued, was a global disaster of such scale that most humans were obliterated, leaving only a few thousand to repopulate the planet. If the numbers are correct, if only 1,000 breeding adults survived, then the implications are staggering. Every human alive today in every corner of the world would descend from this tiny, precarious group. Our shared genetic heritage would be traced back to a moment when humanity nearly ceased to exist. It would mean that the remarkable diversity of language, culture, and biology that we see today was built from a foundation far narrower than previously imagined. The traits that allowed survival, resilience, cooperation, adaptability would have been amplified through natural selection in a compressed population, encoded in the DNA of all subsequent generations. Yet the theory is not without controversy. Some scientists argue that archaeological evidence challenges the idea of a catastrophic, near-total collapse. Sites along the southern African coast, such as Pinnacle Point, show continuous human occupation during and after the Toba eruption. Thousands of artifacts, stone tools, signs of controlled fire, evidence of fishing and shellfish collection suggest that some populations not only survived, but thrived in these refuges. To these researchers, Toba may have been devastating elsewhere, but humans in Africa were insulated by geography, climate, and access to stable food sources. The bottleneck may have been less severe than 1,000 individuals, perhaps involving tens of thousands. Even so, the genetic evidence cannot be ignored. Low variability in human DNA points to a period of extreme restriction in population size. The Toba eruption provides a plausible temporal anchor for this contraction, aligning roughly with molecular clock estimates and archaeological findings. The combination of catastrophic environmental stress and the stochastic nature of survival in scattered refuges could plausibly produce the genetic pattern observed today. Whether it was exactly 1,000 individuals or slightly more, the reality remains chilling. Humanity came terrifyingly close to disappearing entirely. The bottleneck hypothesis also sheds light on broader evolutionary questions. A dramatic reduction in population would have intensified natural selection. Traits advantageous for survival in extreme conditions, cooperation, foresight, technological skills, social cohesion, would have been heavily favored. Those groups capable of exploiting coastal resources, managing fire, and coordinating complex hunting strategies would disproportionately contribute to the gene pool. In other words, the traits that define modern humans, from social cognition to tool-making, may have been amplified by the crucible of near extinction. Anthropologists also consider the role of chance. Survival was not guaranteed by intelligence or skill alone. It was geographically contingent. Groups located in inland regions with disrupted rainfall or collapsed food sources were extinguished. Those along southern African coasts or in other refugia buffered by oceanic and climatic stability endured. Geography became a decisive factor in evolution. Every human today owes a fragment of their existence to the arbitrary placement of their ancestors in these safe zones. The implications extend beyond biology. They force a reconsideration of the story of human dispersal. If the Toba eruption reduced humanity to a fraction of its previous population, then migration out of Africa, later waves of settlement across Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas, all originated from this narrow bottleneck. The cultural and technological developments that followed, art, language, ritual, and early innovation, emerged from a population compressed in number but honed in resilience. The survivors' experiences, strategies, and social structures set the stage for everything that came after. In a way, the 1,000 survivors theory transforms the Toba eruption from a distant geological curiosity into the defining event in human history. It is a reminder that our existence has never been guaranteed, that the line between survival and extinction is perilously thin. Every genome carries the memory of this event. Every individual is a descendant not of millions, but of a select few who endured the darkness, the cold, and the famine of a world nearly obliterated. Some researchers have modeled the genetic consequences of this bottleneck using simulations of population dynamics. These models consistently show that even a small number of survivors, if reproductively successful and geographically distributed, could regenerate a global human population. But the process is fragile. Any additional stress, disease, drought, conflict could have driven humans beyond recovery. The Toba survivors were living on the edge of a cliff, where every choice, every encounter, every hunt carried existential weight. The theory also carries a philosophical resonance. Humanity today, thriving, populous, technologically advanced, is the product of an extraordinarily narrow escape. Our species is, in essence, the legacy of a few thousand survivors who navigated catastrophe with a combination of ingenuity, cooperation, and luck. This realization challenges our perception of human permanence. It reveals that the human story is not linear or inevitable. It is punctuated by moments of extreme vulnerability, moments when the entirety of our species could have vanished, leaving no trace beyond the rock's ash and DNA buried in the soil. And yet, despite this precarious past, humanity endures. From a few scattered survivors, the species rebounds, spreading outward from coastal refuges, moving across continents, and slowly recolonizing the globe. The bottleneck does not simply represent extinction avoided. It marks a turning point in the evolution of behavior, cognition, and society. Traits that proved advantageous during the volcanic winter, social cohesion, tool-making, foresight, become the foundation of modern humanity. The Toba eruption, therefore, is not just a geological event. It is a crucible that shaped the trajectory of our species. The 1,000 survivors theory captures the extremity of that event, a moment when humanity was reduced to a whisper, a small cohort whose endurance determined the existence of every person alive today. Every genome carries their story, every adaptation, every behavior, every spark of innovation, a reflection of the pressures faced in a world turned dark and cold. The idea is almost impossible to grasp. To imagine all of humanity teetering on the brink, reduced to a handful of individuals, scattered across a few refuges, each carrying the weight of the species' survival, is both terrifying and humbling. Many struggled with this idea, so scientists provide evidence of the catastrophe. When the Toba supervolcano erupted, the scale of destruction was unlike anything experienced in the lifetimes of our species. It was not simply a local event confined to Sumatra. It was a global phenomenon, leaving scars that could be traced thousands of miles away. Scientists reconstruct this story by examining the evidence that persists in rocks, sediments, and DNA, each fragment whispering of the near collapse of humanity. The eruption itself defies comprehension. Estimates suggest that nearly 2,500 cubic kilometers of magma erupted in a single event, a volume of rock equivalent to millions of Empire State Buildings stacked atop one another. Pyroclastic flows scoured the land, flattening forests and obliterating ecosystems in their path. Rivers of molten rock surged to the sea, instantly transforming the geography of the island. The energy released would have been audible across the planet. In its immediate vicinity, the landscape was unrecognizable, a molten wasteland. The scale alone is staggering, but it is only the beginning of the story. Ash from Toba traveled further than any eruption in recorded history. Microscopic shards of volcanic glass ejected into the atmosphere settled across Asia, the Indian Ocean, and parts of Africa. Layers of tephra are identified in geological records thousands of kilometers from Sumatra, in India and the South China Sea, chemically matching the composition of Toba. Each shard, invisible to the naked eye, carries a unique fingerprint, a chemical signature that allows scientists to link sediments across the globe to a single cataclysmic event. The widespread distribution of ash demonstrates not just the magnitude of the eruption, but its global reach, an event capable of influencing climate systems worldwide. Climate models provide further evidence. Researchers have simulated the dispersal of volcanic aerosols and dust, revealing the severity of the resulting cooling. Stratospheric sulfur aerosols would have reflected sunlight back into space, dimming the sun and dropping global temperatures by several degrees. In some models, regional cooling reaches as much as 10 degrees in the northern hemisphere, with shifts in precipitation and monsoon patterns across the tropics. Such cooling, even for a few years, would have destabilized ecosystems, collapsing food chains and reducing the survivability of human populations. Coastal refuges like those in southern Africa may have mitigated these effects, but inland regions were likely plunged into famine and desolation. The genetic evidence is equally compelling. Modern humans exhibit remarkably low genetic diversity, consistent with a population bottleneck occurring around the time of Toba's eruption. Mitochondrial DNA analyses, nuclear genomes, and patterns of mutation all point to a period when only a few thousand individuals carried forward the species. Microsatellite data, which tracks repetitive DNA sequences, reveal that most pre-existing diversity was lost during this interval. The genetic record, in this sense, functions as a molecular chronicle of near extinction, preserving the memory of an event that left humanity teetering on the brink. Archaeology corroborates the story, but with intriguing complexity. Sites like Pinnacle Point in southern Africa show continuous human occupation across the period of the eruption. Thousands of stone tools, evidence of fire use, shellfish consumption, and other innovations reveal that humans were adapting, surviving, and even thriving in certain coastal refuges. These discoveries challenge a simplistic narrative of total annihilation, suggesting that the Toba eruption's effects were uneven, spatially variable, and mediated by geography. Humans in some regions faced near-total collapse, while others maintained continuity, carrying forward the lineage that would repopulate the planet. Yet even as the evidence mounts, anomalies emerge. Climate proxies from regions such as Lake Malawi indicate that in parts of Africa the eruption may not have caused catastrophic cooling. Some simulations suggest that the sulfur aerosols in the atmosphere may have clumped together, settling faster than expected and limiting long-term climatic effects. Genetic data also show signs of recovery and diversification in relatively short periods, hinting that humans, in at least some refuges, were resilient enough to endure without catastrophic mortality rates everywhere. These discrepancies introduce a tension in the narrative. Toba was a cataclysm, yet it was not uniform. Its impact varied across geography, ecology, and human population density. Geological layers hold additional clues. Beyond the tephra, sediments reveal changes in flora and fauna, shifts in fire frequency, and alterations in river and lake systems. Evidence of plant die-off, local extinctions, and altered sedimentation patterns paints a picture of ecological upheaval. In East Africa, researchers have documented increased wildfires and plant stress immediately following the eruption. Yet even here, some species survived, suggesting a mosaic of destruction and refuge rather than uniform annihilation. The Earth itself, in its layers of ash and soil, preserves a nuanced story of catastrophe tempered by persistence. This mosaic is mirrored in human behavior. Anthropologists studying tool assemblages and settlement patterns observe continuity in some regions and abrupt changes in others. Stone tool technologies evolve rapidly in response to environmental stress, evidence that humans were innovating in the wake of disaster. Coastal populations rely more heavily on marine resources, exploiting shellfish, fish, and sea mammals to buffer against terrestrial scarcity. These behaviors reflect the selective pressures imposed by the eruption and the volcanic winter, illustrating human adaptability even amid extreme stress. Taken together, the magnitude of the eruption, the global ash distribution, the climate simulations, the genetic bottleneck, and the archaeological record, a picture emerges of near extinction. Humanity was reduced to scattered, isolated populations, some vanishing entirely, others persisting against incredible odds. The Toba eruption created a world in which survival was extraordinary, not expected. It was a moment when the entire species hovered at the edge, a narrow corridor through which the entirety of humanity passed. And yet, something does not fully align. The evidence is compelling, but it is not complete. The humans who survived left traces of innovation and occupation that suggest resilience beyond what might be expected if only 1,000 individuals persisted. Climate proxies vary regionally. Genetic diversity, while low, is not zero. The mosaic of survival and extinction complicates the narrative, hinting that the Toba eruption was neither absolute annihilation nor negligible disaster. The Earth itself holds these other clues, subtle and profound. It suggests a story not of total obliteration, but of extreme challenge and uneven survival. Mountains, rivers, coastlines, and refuges dictated the contours of survival. Humans endured in some regions while disappearing in others. Life was fractured but not extinguished. The Toba eruption was a crucible shaping the course of evolution and the trajectory of human history. But it was neither entirely uniform in effect nor entirely predictable in outcome. What emerges is a vision of the past that is both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Near extinction was a real possibility, yet life persisted. Humanity, diminished in number and confined to refuge, carried forward the genetic and cultural foundations that would eventually allow a species on the brink to recolonize the world. The Earth, in its layers of ash, sediment, and fossil record, preserves both the devastation and the resilience, telling a story that is as nuanced as it is extraordinary. Do you agree with it? The more scientists uncover, the more it seems that, at least in some regions, humans endured, adapted, and even flourished amidst the chaos. Consider Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of Africa, one of the most significant archaeological sites shedding light on this period. Excavations have revealed continuous occupation spanning the time of the Toba eruption. Layers of sediment interspersed with volcanic ash show that humans were present before, during, and after the catastrophic event. More than 400,000 artifacts have been recovered from this site alone: heat-treated stone tools, bone implements, remnants of fire use, and shells indicating sustained exploitation of coastal resources. These findings paint a picture not of a species collapsing under catastrophe, but of one responding, innovating, and persisting. The artifact record at Pinnacle Point suggests subtle but significant behavioral adaptations. Early humans intensified their use of marine resources, exploiting shellfish, fish, and other coastal food sources that were less susceptible to the disruption of inland ecosystems. They refined stone tools using heat treatment techniques, enhancing their durability and efficiency. Fire, already a central aspect of human life, becomes even more critical, supporting cooking, warmth, and protection in an environment where terrestrial food was scarcer. These innovations point to a species capable of resilience in the face of extreme environmental stress, an intelligence honed by necessity rather than random chance. Similar patterns emerge elsewhere. In India, archaeologists have found tools that appear both below and above layers of Toba ash, indicating that local populations continue to inhabit the region despite the eruption. Sediments reveal human activity that does not stop with the volcanic fallout. Instead, they suggest continuity, showing that people remained in place, exploiting whatever resources were available, adapting their hunting and gathering strategies to a changing environment. Even if numbers were reduced in some areas, local populations clearly endured. Climate reconstructions from Africa further complicate the narrative of near extinction. Analyses of lake sediments, pollen records, and other proxies indicate that while the Toba eruption likely caused some cooling, its effects in southern Africa may have been relatively modest. Temperatures might have dropped a few degrees, monsoons shifted, and droughts occurred in places, but nowhere near the catastrophic decades-long volcanic winter originally hypothesized. This environmental buffering could explain why coastal refuges allowed human populations to persist when inland regions suffered. Africa, it seems, offered resilience not found elsewhere. Taken together, these findings suggest a troubling possibility for the traditional 1,000 survivors theory. Perhaps humanity did not contract to the extreme degree once imagined. Perhaps the genetic bottleneck inferred from modern DNA reflects not a single catastrophic event, but a combination of smaller demographic fluctuations and population dispersals. The low diversity in human genes could be explained by other factors: geographical constraints, founder effects, localized extinctions, and subsequent expansions, rather than a near-complete annihilation. Yet reconciling the scale of the eruption with these survival stories raises further questions. How could such a colossal event capable of spreading ash across continents and disrupting climate leave certain populations relatively unscathed? The answer may lie in geography, resource availability, and human adaptability. Coastal regions, rich in predictable food sources, offered natural refuges. Marine ecosystems, buffered from terrestrial collapse, provided a steady supply of nutrition. Small groups could huddle in caves or along shorelines, maintaining social cohesion and passing knowledge across generations. The eruption may have been a devastating environmental shock, but it was neither uniform nor universally lethal. The archaeological evidence also challenges assumptions about the speed and severity of Toba's climatic impact. Early models suggested a volcanic winter lasting decades, plunging the planet into extreme cold and famine. But sedimentary analysis, climate proxies, and modern simulations indicate a shorter, more variable period of cooling. Aerosols may have clumped and settled faster than previously estimated, limiting the long-term global impact. While the eruption undoubtedly caused environmental stress, it may not have driven humans to the edge everywhere. Survival was possible, and humans exploited opportunities wherever they arose. These discoveries do not merely revise the numbers, they reshape our understanding of early human behavior. Survival during Toba was not simply a matter of luck. It required ingenuity, flexibility, and social cooperation. The archaeological record shows that humans developed strategies to buffer themselves against uncertainty, diversify their food sources, and maintain technological continuity. Innovation did not pause. It accelerated in response to environmental challenge. Coastal refuges like Pinnacle Point were not static shelters. They were incubators of resilience, laboratories in which early humans refined the traits that would define our species. Even the notion of a bottleneck can be reevaluated in light of this evidence. Rather than a single catastrophic population collapse, we may be looking at a patchwork of contractions and expansions. Some groups faced severe losses while others maintained viable populations. Migration and gene flow between refuges would have allowed the persistence of genetic diversity even in the face of localized hardship. In this scenario, humanity's story becomes less one of near extinction and more one of selective endurance, of small populations navigating a world of extremes and transmitting their survival strategies across generations. The evidence against absolute extinction forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. If humanity persisted in multiple refuges, then the 1,000 survivors idea, while dramatic, may be an oversimplification. The species' resilience, social ingenuity, and strategic use of resources may have prevented the annihilation once thought inevitable. Yet paradoxically, the fact that genetic diversity remains low suggests that the Toba eruption, or perhaps a combination of environmental stresses including glacial cycles, drought, and other volcanic activity, did indeed impose a bottleneck, albeit one more nuanced and geographically complex than previously imagined. Ultimately, the archaeological record teaches us that survival is never a single narrative. Pinnacle Point and other coastal refuges show continuity and innovation. India and parts of Africa reveal that human life persisted despite ashfall. Climate proxies indicate that the full force of catastrophe was not globally uniform. Humanity did not vanish entirely. It endured, adapting to survive in the shadow of an extraordinary event. And yet, the shadow itself remains profound. Even if humans were not reduced to a mere 1,000, the Toba eruption was a crucible that tested the limits of endurance, intelligence, and adaptability. The species that emerged, whatever the size of the population, carried forward the lessons of survival under extreme environmental stress. It is in this context that the debate over near extinction becomes more than academic. It is a reflection of humanity's capacity to endure, adapt, and innovate in the face of overwhelming odds. The vision of Toba as a singular, planet-wide apocalypse begins to fracture when examined through the lens of modern climate science. Early models painted a terrifyingly uniform picture: sulfur-laden clouds, global temperatures plunging, ecosystems collapsing in every corner of the globe. It was easy to imagine humanity teetering on the edge of oblivion. Yet, as computational power and paleoclimate data improve, a more nuanced story emerges. The eruption, colossal in every sense, did not strike the Earth evenly. Its devastation was patchy, mediated by geography, atmospheric dynamics, and local environmental conditions. Simulations using hundreds of global climate models reveal a striking disparity between hemispheres. In the northern hemisphere, regions of Asia and Europe bore the brunt of Toba's wrath. Temperatures in some areas may have fallen as much as 10 degrees Celsius. Monsoon patterns were disrupted, rivers and lakes experienced altered water levels. Precipitation declined in regions dependent on regular rainfall. These changes would have had catastrophic consequences for local flora and fauna. Herds of herbivores would have struggled to find sufficient forage, and carnivores dependent on them would have faced starvation. Humans living inland, far from the stabilizing influence of coasts or large water bodies, would have been particularly vulnerable. Starvation, social collapse, and local extinction likely followed in these regions. Meanwhile, the southern hemisphere presents a very different picture. Africa, especially its southern coastal regions, appears to have been partially shielded. Climate proxies from lakes and sediment cores indicate only modest cooling, perhaps a few degrees at most, and relatively stable rainfall in certain regions. These refugees offered resources that were less susceptible to the immediate consequences of Toba's eruption. Marine ecosystems continued to function, providing shellfish, fish, and other coastal resources. Dense coastal vegetation, while stressed, persisted enough to support small terrestrial mammals, giving humans a reliable, if limited, food base. The contrast between hemispheres is stark: devastation in the north, endurance in the south, a fragmented world of extinction and survival. This unevenness reframes the narrative of Toba from one of total annihilation to a fragmented catastrophe. It was not a uniform extinction event that eradicated humanity across the planet. Instead, the eruption created zones of devastation interspersed with zones of refuge. Populations in Asia and Europe may have been decimated or wiped out entirely, while those along the southern African coast and possibly in parts of India and Southeast Asia survived. Human life became a mosaic of extinction and persistence, a series of demographic islands scattered across a changed world. Evidence from archaeology aligns with this interpretation. Sites like Pinnacle Point, where humans continued to occupy caves and exploit coastal resources, illustrate that survival was possible even during the immediate aftermath of the eruption. Stone tools continued to be manufactured, fire was maintained, and shellfish consumption increased, suggesting behavioral flexibility and resourcefulness. In India, layers of stone tools both below and above Toba ash show continuity of occupation, implying that some inland groups weathered the eruption or quickly recovered afterward. Survival was not universal, but it was real, and it was strategic. Genetic evidence further complements this vision of a fragmented apocalypse. While human diversity indicates a population bottleneck, the bottleneck may not have been absolute. Populations in refugia would have maintained sufficient genetic variation to prevent complete genetic collapse, even if other groups perished. This is reflected in mitochondrial DNA, which, while showing reduced diversity, does not collapse entirely. In other words, humanity endured not as a single population of 1,000 survivors, but as multiple scattered groups, each facing varying pressures and challenges. Some of these groups persisted, carrying forward the genetic and cultural heritage of our species. The unevenness of Toba's impact also offers insight into evolutionary pressures. In refuges, humans faced extreme but survivable conditions. They had to adapt their subsistence strategies, intensify cooperation, and refine tools and behaviors to maximize survival. Those traits that proved advantageous in these refuges: resilience, foresight, cooperation, flexibility, would be disproportionately transmitted to subsequent generations. In regions devastated by ash and cooling, populations may have been lost entirely, but the survivors in more protected areas became the foundation upon which modern humanity would build. This fragmented perspective also helps reconcile contradictions between genetic data and archaeological evidence. While some DNA evidence suggests a dramatic reduction in population size, the archaeological record indicates continuity and even innovation in certain locations. Rather than a single catastrophic wipeout, humanity experienced a patchwork of survival. Some groups disappeared, others endured. The eruption's effects were severe enough to reshape populations and reduce diversity, but not so severe as to eradicate humanity entirely. In essence, Toba acted as both a filter and a forge, eliminating some populations while strengthening the adaptive capabilities of others. Even the climatic effects themselves were uneven in time as well as space. While initial cooling may have been pronounced in certain regions, the planet gradually equilibrated. Sulfur aerosols eventually settled, sunlight returned, and ecosystems began to stabilize. In some areas, human populations could rebuild relatively quickly. In others, extinction or migration was the only recourse. The apocalypse was not uniform, but a process unfolding at different rates and intensities across the globe, creating a patchwork of ecological and demographic responses. The consequences of this fragmentation resonate far beyond the immediate aftermath. Humanity's global distribution would be shaped by the survivors of these refuges. Later dispersals out of Africa, across Asia, and eventually into Europe would emerge from populations that endured Toba. The eruption may have reset migration patterns, redirected gene flow, and even influenced cultural and technological evolution. Traits that enhanced survival in refuge, problem-solving, social cohesion, resourcefulness, became amplified within the population, shaping the trajectory of human development for millennia. What do you think about this theory? Why did humanity survive when so much else perished? The answer is not simple. It is a combination of geography, biology, behavior, and perhaps a measure of chance that ultimately preserved the thread of our species through one of Earth's most profound environmental crises. The first and most obvious factor lies in geography. Coastal regions, particularly along the southern edge of Africa, offered a refuge from the worst effects of volcanic winter. Inland regions suffered from catastrophic loss of vegetation and the collapse of terrestrial food chains, but the ocean remained a reliable source of nourishment. Shellfish, fish, sea urchins, and other tidal resources provided a steady, predictable food supply, less affected by sudden drops in temperature or reduced sunlight. In places like Pinnacle Point, humans took full advantage of these marine ecosystems. Archaeological records reveal thousands of shells, fish bones, and other marine remains, indicating that these populations were exploiting the full range of resources available to them. In a world where land-based sustenance had failed, the ocean became a lifeline. But geography alone does not explain survival. Intelligence and adaptability played an equally crucial role. Humans in these refuges were not passive observers of catastrophe. They were active problem solvers. Stone tools were refined, fire use intensified, and food preparation techniques evolved to extract maximum nutrition. Heat treatment of stone, for example, made tools sharper and more durable, allowing early humans to hunt more effectively and process food with greater efficiency. These innovations were not merely technical. They were survival strategies. They reflect the capacity of humans to adapt quickly in response to extreme environmental stress, to rethink habits and behaviors to meet the challenge of a changing world. Social structures also mattered. Survival in such extreme conditions required cooperation. Groups had to share resources, teach skills, and maintain social cohesion under the strain of scarcity. Knowledge of which coastal resources were reliable, how to process and preserve them, and how to build shelters or manage fire would have been passed from one generation to the next. These networks of cooperation were not merely cultural. They were life-sustaining. Groups that worked together effectively would have had a decisive advantage over smaller, fragmented bands that could not pool knowledge or share resources. Social intelligence, therefore, became a tool for endurance, shaping the human capacity for collaboration in ways that would echo through evolutionary time. Even with refuge, intelligence, and cooperation, survival was precarious. Chance played a decisive role. Groups that happened to be located in areas buffered from the worst cooling, near reliable marine resources or fresh water, had a higher likelihood of making it through the crisis. Other populations, separated by distance or terrain from these protective refuges, may have perished entirely. The Toba eruption, with its massive but uneven global impact, was indiscriminate in some ways, yet spatially selective in others. Survival required being in the right place at the right time, an intersection of circumstance and adaptability. Environmental variability also influenced who survived. Climate simulations indicate that the northern hemisphere suffered far more severe cooling than the southern. Africa, while impacted, experienced milder temperature declines and more stable rainfall in certain coastal areas. These conditions allowed ecosystems to persist, at least partially, providing the food and materials necessary to sustain human populations. Populations living in marginal environments elsewhere faced famine and collapse, but those in refuges, protected by geography, climate, and resources, maintained continuity. Survival in this context becomes not just a matter of biology, but of environmental luck and resilience. The psychological dimension should not be overlooked. Humans facing extreme environmental stress may have been forced to innovate not only in tools and techniques, but in social organization, planning, and long-term thinking. Groups capable of anticipating seasonal fluctuations, storing food, or exploiting new resources would have fared better than those constrained by rigid routines or inflexible strategies. Survival required foresight, flexibility, and problem-solving, a mental toolkit that became encoded in human behavior and, over time, influenced the evolutionary trajectory of the species. Even with all these factors in play, it is remarkable that humanity survived at all. The Toba eruption, measured in cubic kilometers of ejected magma, microscopic shards of glass and sulfur-laden clouds stretching across continents, represents one of the most severe environmental crises in the history of modern humans. Entire populations disappeared, ecosystems were disrupted on a massive scale. And yet a few groups using intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability persisted. They were small in number, geographically isolated and vulnerable, but they endured. Chance, however, cannot be underestimated. The survivors of Toba were not necessarily the strongest, fastest, or most intelligent humans in the absolute sense. They were the ones who, by circumstance, found themselves in refuges where marine resources, mild climates, and shelter offered a lifeline. They were the ones whose social networks enabled resource sharing, whose behaviors permitted adaptation, whose ingenuity turned survival into a sustained occupation of space and time. In evolutionary terms, being in the right place at the right time was as important as any biological trait. The survival of these groups laid the foundation for all subsequent human history. From a few small populations along the southern African coast, humans would disperse, repopulate, and eventually spread across continents. The traits honed during this period, cooperation, innovation, resourcefulness, became hallmarks of the species. Humanity did not just survive Toba, it was reshaped by the experience, strengthened in ways that would define its evolutionary path. In this light, survival is not a simple story of numbers. It is a story of environment, intelligence, social behavior, and chance, all intersecting in a crucible of unprecedented environmental stress. The Toba eruption tested humanity to its limits, and only a handful of groups endured. But their endurance was sufficient. It was enough to carry the genetic and cultural legacy forward, enough to seed the future of the species. Perhaps then the lesson is not merely that humans survived, but that survival itself is an emergent property of multiple factors, some within our control, some entirely accidental. Coastal refuges, intelligence, cooperation, and luck converged to preserve the thread of humanity through one of the greatest environmental catastrophes in history. Without these convergences, our species might have vanished. Instead, we persisted, carrying forward the genes, behaviors, and innovations that would allow humans to conquer new landscapes, adapt to new climates, and ultimately tell the story of Toba some 74,000 years later. Today, every human being carries within them a story that predates history itself. A story not written in books, not preserved in monuments, but encoded in our very DNA. It is a story of endurance, of resilience against odds that would seem insurmountable. The eruption of the Toba supervolcano was more than a geological event. It was a test, a crucible that threatened to erase our species. And while we cannot remember it consciously, every cell, every chromosome, every inherited trait carries a trace of the survivors who endured that ancient catastrophe. In the end, survival was neither guaranteed nor predictable. It was the product of circumstance, adaptation, and persistence. Humanity endured not because the world was kind, but because we were capable of responding to it with ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience. A few small groups in the right place at the right time carried forward the future of the species, and that, against all odds, was enough. If this journey through our past helped you understand what it takes to survive, subscribe to Science of Survival. We release new documentaries every week, exploring extinction, adaptation, and the fragile line that keeps humanity alive.